Alright guys, this is part 2 of a seminar John gave at Cabela's in Tulalip, Washington. In part 2, John will talk about being prepared after your harvest is on the ground. John has some great advice to help your work in the field result in less work at home.
Now, one other thing that you might consider throwing in your pack is a small knife sharpener. I've been in the business a long time. I know how to keep an edge on a knife. But if you're not experienced, a lot of times you're going to be cutting into the bone, and that's going to roll that edge on the knife and not keep it as sharp as it should be, and you're going to need to put the edge back on your knife. This has a simple little steel that you can help straighten the edge back out with, as well as two areas that have a V-shaped crisscross to them that you'll draw your knife across. That'll help maintain that edge back on your knife. But those are the core essentials I have in my pack. I can deal with any big game animal on the ground with what I have right here, whether it's an elk, a deer, a moose, or bear. I can take care of that animal and get the temperature cooling in no time at all. So here's a Pope and Young bull that I shot over in the Olympic Peninsula, and it's preparation for after the shot. I had these core essentials with me, and I was able to handle this animal that was pushing 800-900 pounds on the hoof. And in September, when it's 70 degrees, and I was able to field dress it, skin it, get it back, and get the meat cooled where I didn't lose anything. And that's what everybody needs to think about. So what you do once that animal's on the ground is going to have a huge impact on how your meat comes out. If it sits there a long time, and I'll talk to it a little bit later, you're going to have some big opportunities that you're going to run into. Temperature control and cooling the animal down is one of the most important things you can do once the animal's on the ground. And it doesn't matter if it's archery season in September or elk season in November. And I can't express enough getting the hide off the animal. Talk about being prepared. And this is a picture of me and my son when he was 4. It was last day of season, but he backed out going elk hunting. I grabbed him at 2:30 in the morning, threw my fanny pack in the truck, said, you know what, I'm going to spend a little quality time with my son up in the outdoors. Really had no intentions of shooting an elk, just spending some time with my son. Well, about 5 hours later, we're up on top of the mountain over in eastern Washington, and we get into elk, and I had the great opportunity to harvest one with my son right next to me at 3 yards. Well, then the work began, because I was up there by myself. I had my son there. Of course, he was of no help other than asking about a million questions. But having the core tools that I talked about and being prepared, and the knowledge that I'm going to teach you today on how to handle the animal, I was able to take care of it, get it back to my vehicle, and not lose any meat. So let's talk a little bit about field dressing. You know, one of the quickest ways to start the cooling process in an animal is to remove the entrails as soon as possible. It's going to aid in the cooling process. You want to wear your latex glove and your cut resistant glove so you don't end up cutting yourself. And then be very careful around the pelvic area. When you're pulling that bladder through, when you're handling the large intestines, you don't want to touch a whole lot of other things. You don't want to pop that bladder and get that urine on the meat, because that's going to end up on your dinner table somewhere. So be cautious about doing that. So the step 1 and 2 here, this will be if I'm going to take this animal and start the skinning process. So if I'm going to skin the animal at the spot, when I field dress it, I'm going to run down the inside of the animal's legs. Why the inside? The hair is less dense, the skin's thinner. I'm going to follow the grain of the hair. I'm not going to cut across it, and I'm going to go under the skin and bring my knife up through and follow it down, cutting upwards, not downwards, into the meat. So you go down the front legs, you go down the hind legs. If you're going to drag this animal back to the truck and it's relatively close, then you can go from 3 to 4 and open that chest cavity up and then remove the entrails. But again, be really careful around the pelvic area, pulling that through. And then one other big area of opportunity that I see in individuals, they don't pull the windpipe out of their animal. So they'll get it home and the windpipe will still be remain in there, and it starts to rot because it's ingesting food through there, you get all the blood. Open that up to the throat unless you've shot a trophy animal and you're going to keep it, then your field, the way you skin your animal is going to be a little different. But make sure you get that windpipe out of the animal. So now you have a decision of, do I pack the animal out, or is it close enough like a deer where I could drag the animal out? So you'll make that decision once you have it field dressed. If you're going to drag it out and your deer is relatively close, or you're not going to have to put it into a pack board, I strongly recommend keeping the hide on the animal. Not too many people are going to drag elk. They're a pretty big animal, but a deer you will. By leaving the hide on, you're going to make sure that meat stays good and clean. When you get back to camp, get it up on a pole, get where you can work with it and skin it properly and cool it down. The muscle density on a deer is nowhere near elk, and the meat's going to cool quicker because you're not trying to go through 15 inches of meat in certain areas. If you're going to pack it out, you're going to need to skin the animal at the harvest site. And that's where a lot of new hunters become very intimidated. And how do I skin it on the ground, especially an elk, if it's your first elk you've shot and you have this huge animal sitting there? How do I skin it out? Well, I'll show you. It's pretty simple to do. And what you're going to do is you're going to peel the hide off of one side. You're going to remove the shoulder. You're going to remove the leg. You're going to bone out the loin meat, throw it in game bags, hang it up. Once that weight's off of that animal, roll it over very easy. Repeat the process, and you can bypass field dressing it. You can leave the guts right in and not waste anything. So it's saving a whole step. At the very end, you can come in the flank here and dig in and pull your tenderloins out. But when you go up to Alaska and you talk to a lot of Alaskans or a lot of guys that elk hunt, especially if they do high hunts by themselves, they're not field dressing the animal. They're just taking the meat off the exterior, and you're really not going to lose anything per se. And I'll show you this technique when I cut up the goat today that we have. I'll show you how to pull that off one side, bone off one side, peel the meat down, flip it over, and take the legs off from there. So it's a pretty simple application. So skinning the animal, you're going to remove the hide of the animal as soon as possible, especially on an elk or moose. Has anybody ever heard of the terminology bone sour? Okay. It's something that's very common in big game animals, especially elk and moose. And what happens is bone sour is the meat did not cool fast enough, where the hide was left on the animal, and it rots from the bone outward. So if you're looking at the animal and it's hanging in your garage and you have an elk quarter up there, what you're going to find is it looks fine. But then you take it to a meat shop to get processed, and you get a phone call and they say, well, 40% of your animal's bad. And you're like, what do you mean? I had this very thing happen not too long ago with a customer where he brought an elk in, and as soon as I walked in, I could smell it in the cooler. I've dealt with bone sour enough. And it has a unique sour smell to it, but you got to get right next to the bone. And so I called the gentleman at home and I said, you know what, I saw you brought your elk in today. I was just going through the cooler. I noticed an odor. I cut into it, and I said, you got a severe problem with your elk. And of course, he was on the defense immediately, and he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, your elk, a large portion of it is rotten. He said, there's no way that can possibly happen. It must be some other animal, or somebody else's animal. And I says, well, why don't you walk me through the process of what happened to your animal when you harvest it? He says, well, I was up in eastern Washington, up on my horse, hunting in the snow, saw an animal just before dark, put it down on the ground. I was by myself. I took the time to field dress the animal, and because there was snow on the ground, I left it there, got the pack horses the next morning, went up and dealt with the elk the next morning. And I says, well, did you pull the hide off of it? Well, no. He goes, I didn't even think of that. Well, here's the thing, and here's what I want you guys to think about, because it's a tough lesson if you have this happen to you. The hide on the animal is like an insulation blanket. It does not let heat escape, okay? So one of the most important things you can do, especially on a big game animal and on an elk up in the neck and chest area where you have muscle density that thick, and the same thing on the hind legs around the femur bones, that meat will not cool if that hide's still on there. It traps it. Sure, where he gutted the animal and field dressed it, it's fine, but the muscle density on the loin meat, even on a good elk, is only this thick. That's going to cool, but that air was not able to get around that animal because it was still laying on the ground. Even though there was snow there, snow is also an insulator as well. So that heat just was stuck in that animal and it rotted from the inside out. And that's the terminology of bone sour. That individual probably lost 45% of that entire elk because it went bad. And the last thing you want to do is get a piece of meat that's bone sour in your hamburger or on your steak, especially if you get it into trim where you're making hamburger. It's going to wreck the whole batch. It'll contaminate everything. And again, as I stated, it's going to happen in those thick muscle areas. So when you're skinning the animal, you're going to use a sharp knife to skin. Try not to cut into the hair. Okay, the hair is going to dull your knife, so be conscientious of that. On a big game animal, skin one half of the animal at a time. And once skinned, like I said, you're going to remove those shoulders, the loins, the legs. You're going to place them in game bags, tie them up to a tree, get the air around them, get them propped up, hang it in the shade if possible to start the cooling process. And then you're going to roll the animal over and repeat the process on the other side. So here's some images of skinning, and this image here on the left, this would be, let's say for example, you have an elk down and you're by yourself, and how do you skin it by yourself? Well, you go on the inside of the legs, this animal's not even field dressed, and then you'll remove the hind leg, you'll remove the front shoulder, bone out the loin meat, peel down the rib meat, and once that's been removed, you just roll that animal back over onto its clean hide, skin the other side, flop it over, and you have a clean work surface, the best you possibly can out in the woods, and you'll be able to keep your meat good and clean. If you get it back to camp or you have a meat pull, here's a great example of peeling it from the hind legs down, and basically you're tubing it out or turning the animal inside out on the way down.
So that is some more great information from John Blank about being prepared after the shot. Make sure you move on to part 3 of this seminar, where John will talk about hanging and aging your harvest.